Welcome everyone to our celebration of migratory birds. My name is Lena Nisley, and I'm a board member for Powered Up Baraboo. For those of you who may not know much about Powered Up Baraboo, we are an all-volunteer organization that seeks to empower residents of Baraboo and Sauk County to take action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by increasing the use of renewable energy, energy conservation, and sustainable practices. We're excited to co-sponsor tonight's talk about migratory birds as part of our effort to protect and strengthen the green spaces around us. Our speakers this evening have spent many years living and working in the Baraboo Hills area. They have a wealth of knowledge on our local ecosystem and how to protect and sustain it. Maia Persche is a wildlife ecologist who works in Wisconsin and in the Central Asian Flyway. Her PhD research was focused on oak woodland restoration and native biodiversity. She is part of the Baraboo Hills Ecology Research Collective. Todd Persche is the recently retired Executive Director of Baraboo Range Preservation Association, a local land trust working in the Baraboo Bluffs. BRPA initially brought the Bird City program to Baraboo some 10 years ago during Todd's tenure. Lisa Hartman is a wildlife biologist and educator living in Leland, Wisconsin, and working with multilingual students and outdoor education at Tower Rock Elementary School. She specializes in turkey vulture research and is part of the Baraboo Hills Ecology Research Collective. Before we start, I'd like to say a special thanks to Barry Hartup, who is a pub supporter and has headed up the Bird City initiative the last few years. Thank you so much. I also like to thank the Carnegie-Schadde Memorial Library for co-sponsoring this event tonight and providing this beautiful space for us to be in. So, let's all welcome our speakers for the evening.
Thank you, Lena. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Pretty well? Great. Well, thanks for coming out tonight. It's so great to see so many people here in support of migratory birds and conservation. Give this a minute. Great. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about some of the species and migratory routes that we are able to see here in southern Wisconsin. And we'll also talk about some of the local research on migratory species that's going on in this area. And then, of course, we'll work in a little bit about conservation and what it means to be part of a bird city, and then what we can do as individuals. So we're celebrating World Migratory Bird Day in May because this is a time when a lot of species throughout the world are all migrating north to temperate areas to nest. And so these are just some of the broad categories of flyways in the world. And of course, we're over here in the Americas flyway, but just so everyone knows that World Migratory Bird Day is something that's being celebrated in bird cities like here in the Americas, but also in different parts of the world. Quite a lot. So within the North America Flyway, in Wisconsin, we're part of the Mississippi Flyway. And this is a really diverse area. There's at least 325 different bird species that use this flyway. A lot of these are songbird species. So things like this Wilson's warbler that's pictured here. Maybe if people are birders, you might have noticed like some of the species that are coming back just in the last few days. Things like grosbeak, scarlet tanagers. And so a lot of these birds are working their way through this flyway from places in northern South America, Central America, up into like the boreal forests in Canada for the summer. So we have a really great opportunity to see a lot of different species. And something that I think is interesting about where we are in Wisconsin is that so many of the birds that are migrating through actually migrate at night. And if you spend time outside looking for birds, usually they seem very diurnal. You might only see them during the day when they're in their stopover sites, like foraging and refueling after migrating. But so many of these species are able to migrate hundreds of miles every night during migration. And so just to take a minute to visualize a little bit about what that means, how many people have paid attention to birdcast before? A few hands? Oh, great, okay, nice. So this is a really interesting new technology that's come about over the past few years, and it's using weather radar to actually pick up movements of hundreds of thousands of different birds as they're taking off to start migration every night. So in this map, each green dot is a different weather radar station. And then the colors that you see are actually birds in the sky that are getting picked up instead of weather because there's so many of them. And the brighter colors just means a higher density of birds. So last night, May 4th, was a really big migration night, especially on the east coast of the US and a little bit south of us here in Wisconsin. So this is kind of a look at how many birds were moving through the sky last night. That red line, that's where sunset is happening. So as the sunset is moving west across the continent, you start to see more and more places where birds are lifting off to start their night migration. And eventually you can start to see where the weather radar is able to pick up the direction that the birds are moving as well, because there's so many of them. So you can also look at some of the statistics here. So this is looking at around 9 o'clock Eastern time, and there's 46 million birds that are in the sky. And as the night goes on, as it gets later and later, more birds join this flight. And it reaches over 200 million birds at one point. And then sunset's making its way further across, close to 500 million birds, 548 million birds at one time flying overhead. And I think it's really amazing that we are able to track this with having this technology, with using weather radar in this way. And I think it's also a great reminder, even though it's based on technology, a good reminder for us to take time to step outside on a spring night like last night and just think about what it means to be in a place where 548.3 million birds are in the sky around us. So a lot of different bird species are making up that number, and I'm just going to talk about one that I think is a really amazing example of a songbird species that we only get to see on migration here in Wisconsin. This is a black-poll warbler, and I'm just curious, how many people have seen one before? Nice, okay. So it's a warbler species, which if you're newer to birding, they can be a challenge to find. They're kind of notorious for being really tiny. Like this bird is 12 grams, so weighs as much as a AAA battery. And they're very small. They move around really fast, often up in the tops of trees because they're foraging for insects. And yeah, they're very tricky to see. But during May, we're able to see them here in Wisconsin as they're making their way on that whole long migration route from northern South America up into the boreal forest, with some individuals reaching all the way up into Alaska. So I wanted to highlight this species because it's one of the birds that makes the longest over-water migration route of any songbird species in the world. And if you've spent much time close to the Atlantic Ocean, and just imagine what it would take for a bird that weighs as much as a battery to fly over the open ocean like that all the way down to South America, is just really staggering. And we're able to learn about this particular bird's migration route because there's something called a geolocator that this bird is wearing on its back. It's a tiny, tiny little piece of equipment that records the position that this bird is at. I think probably once a day it would turn on. And so biologists are able to attach this to birds when they're up in their breeding grounds, so when they're nesting. There's a weight limit, so you can't put anything on a bird that weighs more than 3% of its body weight. So there was a long time where there just wasn't any technology that could record location data and could store it, and also was so tiny you could put it on a bird that weighed 12 grams. So this is kind of a newer thing that's happening over the past decade or a little bit longer. And it allows us to kind of piece together where birds are going during their migration routes and during the wintering grounds. And so you can see that where the green dots should all be connected to a few blue triangles where the bird stopped during migration, and then those are connected to at least one wintering area in South America. So piecing together where a bird goes throughout its life, what habitat it depends on, is all really important for conservation. And of course, go through this a little bit quickly, but probably if you're here tonight, you know that bird populations throughout the world are not all doing great right now, especially for migratory species that have these really risky, long migration flights 2 times a year. As the world is just changing and changing due to basically ways that humans have modified things, a lot of birds and a lot of groups of birds are declining. If we just think about what's happening here in North America, this is just kind of a broad overview of how things since the 1970s have changed. If you look at that dotted line in the middle of the graph, that's 0, so that shows where nothing has changed. So any groups that are below that line have been declining since the 1970s. For us in the Mississippi River Flyway, it's especially important to look at the eastern forest birds, maybe a little bit of the grassland birds. And then, there are cases where water birds are more common than they used to be. So I think this is showing, a lot of declines, but also some conservation success. This all is from a paper that came out in 2019. And so just to look a little bit more how things have changed in the last 7 years since then, this study came out earlier this year, and it shows that in some cases, in a lot of the cases, birds are still having these population declines, and there's certain hotspots around North America where they're declining at a faster and faster rate. And so any place that's showing up in bright red is not doing great for bird conservation right now. And you can obviously see the Midwest is really showing up as this hotspot of accelerating bird decline. The scientists who wrote this paper noted that a lot of the species that are declining are not really species that are associated with high quality forest habitat or really intact grassland habitat. A lot of them are species you would think of as sort of farmland birds or birds you might see in your backyards, birds at the edges of forests, so eastern towhee, field sparrow, indigo bunting is on this list. And so these are species that really kind of need the habitats that we have a big influence on as humans. They also found that there was a pretty strong association between intensive agriculture and especially neonicotinoid use and places where birds are declining. So in the Midwest, we do have a lot of agriculture. I think it's good to note, if you zoomed in on this map a lot, I don't think the Baraboo Range in particular is a hot spot of bird decline. But it is important to note that in the context of where we are in the Midwest, these little changes that we could think about making for bird conservation could have a really big effect. Of course, birds are declining because of a lot of other things going on in ecosystems. They're really good indicators of ecosystem health. So if we're seeing a lot of insects that are declining, I think something like 95% of birds in Wisconsin depend on insects, especially during the nesting season. So these things are really connected. Same thing with introduced species being quite common. Throughout the world, but especially in the US right now. A lot of the habitats that birds are returning to nest every year are looking really different than they were a few decades ago. So I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about just how amazing it is that we have these bird migrations and thinking about the threats that are facing a lot of these species as well. And those two different emotions are kind of what went into starting World Migratory Bird Day back in 1993. And so this day has been really focused on trying to raise awareness about migratory species. And it started up in North America, I think by the Smithsonian, and really just thinking about the connections in species that nest here and where they're going in South and Central America. And now it's expanded quite a bit around the world. Each year, an artist is featured who makes a portfolio of work that has to do with some group of species that are selected because they're telling part of a conservation story. And this year, the conservation theme that we're thinking about is called Every Bird Counts, and it's all about ways that community science have shaped our understanding of birds. And so each one, this artist actually does embroidery. These are all really amazing, like hand-embroidered pieces of artwork. And the species that she's embroidered all tell some story about community science. And so today I wanted to talk about this one, the merlin, and what that has to do with our understanding of bird species. So how many people have seen a merlin before and know that it's not an app on our phones? It's really a bird. It's an amazing falcon species, like a little bit bigger than an American kestrel, which might be the more common one that more people have seen. This is a raptor that nests in forests across the north part of North America, actually around Eurasia as well. And it migrates across pretty much the entire continent. It has one of the longer migration routes of any raptor. And unlike the birds I was talking about earlier, it migrates during the day. And then, of course, it will stop to forage during migration. So there's been reports of them even like within the city of Baraboo, which is really nice from a bird city perspective. So the conservation story that the merlin is a focal species of this year is a Hawkwatch program. And Hawkwatch is a really common community science program, but it happens in really specific locations. And we don't necessarily have any Hawkwatch stations close to us here in southern Wisconsin. Has anyone visited a Hawkwatch? Nice, a few people. Okay, so these are places where people gather usually like up in the highest point in the landscape and watch raptors throughout the day as they're migrating, because they tend to be like funneled through these places. And so unfortunately, hawk watching got its start because these used to be places where it was really easy to hunt raptors, like a lot of them all at once as they were getting funneled through on migration. And so this picture's old, it's pretty blurry, but those are all hawks that people went and hunted at Hawk Mountain, which today is like the most famous place for hawk conservation. So it's really like a story that has changed over the decades. But hawks were hunted because they were seen as competitors for small game that people wanted to hunt here back in the 1800s, early 1900s. And then as that was wrapping up, DDT became something that was used really commonly here to control insects. And of course, that affected a lot of raptor populations, like especially bald eagle is one that most people have probably heard of. So as people were kind of starting to realize that hawk populations were declining so much, different stations like Hawk Mountain started to get set up where local people would go to a place where they knew hawks were migrating and just start keeping track of like what numbers of what species were going by, which is really great. That's kind of like the heart of community science, right? Is people who might not necessarily be trained as biologists just going out and trying to observe the species in their landscapes. But this was not super useful. I mean, it was useful locally, but these data weren't really helpful if you're thinking about conservation of species that might have a range that covers an entire country, because you really need to think like at this larger scale. And so in the 1970s, some of the hawk watchers started thinking about a way where they could work together a little bit more and try to collect standardized data, try to be able to look into bigger trends than just what was happening at their individual locations. So they held a conference that was advertised in the New York Times, which is really not how bird research conferences work today. It's very different. And I found a photocopy of this announcement that I know you can't read from here, so I just highlighted a few sentences from in here. And I think, I mean, first of all, it's great that they're trying to all work together. They have this bigger vision that really laid the foundation for hawk watching today. But I was just laughing a lot at this last sentence. For those who might be coming to this conference who feel that the Holiday Inn is too costly, the host committee has compiled a list of camping out and sleeping bag possibilities, which I think is great because if anyone has spent time with hawk watchers, this is like exactly how the culture is still today, is trying to just spend as little money as you can and see as most hawks as you can. So this conference had a really big influence. This picture up at the top here is Fran Hammerstrom, who is a biologist who worked in Wisconsin for a long time. And I think she was the only woman at the conference and had a really big influence, so glad to see Wisconsin was represented well. And after this conference, sites were much more connected. Every year, a publication summarized everyone's data and was shared among the different stations. At first, everything was kind of done by hand, and so the report would come out for 1 year, like a few days before everyone would start collecting the data for the next year. So there was kind of this lag. And then eventually it was possible to start making long-distance phone calls between stations to sort of warn people, like, oh, if you saw 5,000 broad-winged hawks at a station in the south one day, maybe you would want to let another station know further up. But again, hawk watchers would try not to spend so much money on this, so there's lots of stories of people staying awake all day to watch hawks and then staying awake all night to make the cheaper long-distance calls between stations. And of course, now we have a system where there's over 200 different stations around North America, and we're all able to kind of enter data just straight into a system that we all can see in real time. So I think as community scientists today, we have it a lot easier than a few decades ago. But this is kind of the result of everyone working together over a long time to collect data across a big area. Thinking back to our Merlin, here we can actually see exact places where its population is increasing at different stations, decreasing in different stations, or staying the same in the stations with the blue circles. So this is a really nice detailed look. It lets us kind of pinpoint our conservation efforts a little more specifically to places where birds might be needing more attention than other places. And this is really done almost entirely by volunteers at hawk watch stations. Some of the stations also work as bird banding sites because, there's really dedicated volunteers, and there's kind of this network set up along migration routes. So it's possible to put a leg band on a raptor in one station and then have it become recaptured at another station, and you can start putting together its migration route. So I think, it's really nice to think about hawk watching, community science in terms of the community effort and the network. And we can switch gears a little bit now and think about how conservation works best in kind of that same framework. And so here, this is no longer a map of where data is collected, but where bird cities are. And so for us, as Bird City Baraboo, we kind of are up in this cluster where there's a lot of bird cities. It's one of the highest densities. And so thinking about birds migrating through this landscape and looking for places to stop, to have good habitat, find some good food, avoid the common migration threats, it's really nice to see that we're playing a role here in this landscape. So now we'll take a break from science and think a little bit more about Bird City.
Okay, that's a tough act to follow. So what you're looking at are pictures from our first Bird City designation, and you might remember old Mayor Mike Palm at the top there. He was getting the sign for the city from Dr. Brian Lenz, who back in 2016 was the guy, I think he was responsible for putting the whole statewide program together. So Brian was, like so many conservationists, a lot of people in this room, we know the statistics about what's going on with the birds, but how do you bring that to the public and do it in a way that they get excited about birds? It's not all gloom and doom. How do you make it a positive experience? So they came up with this Bird City program based largely upon Tree City. So there's a lot of tenets that also kind of mix with Arbor Day and things like that, and their Tree City program. We are, as far as I know, we're still a Tree City. So some of these photos, they came from, well, I guess they all came from that, the Maxwell Potter Arboretum. Any of you ever been to that down in the south part of the city? So the group I used to work for, the Baraboo Range Preservation Association, we are a land trust that works in the Baraboo Bluffs, but we also spent a lot of time in the city, and at this time, they were really amenable to doing the Bird City program. So I myself went to a Wisconsin Society for Ornithology conference about a year before this and met some of these folks. And while they do have some of the disheartening numbers about species dropping, they also have a lot of positive stories and people working on it. I think that's fantastic. So we tried to bring that with this program into the town. You might notice George Archibald up there with Hope the crane. He's kind of known for international birds and migrating birds and things like that too. But just down to the bottom, here's some city alders hanging out. That was a fun day, not only talking about birds, but also talking about the native species they wanted to put in this little part in the city that really, it's much more developed now with trees. A lot of them are labeled. The paths through there are a lot cleaner. So that was cool to see. All right, so I'm going to talk just a little bit about the Bird City program and the requirements. It really hasn't changed that much. And then I'm going to have Dr. Hartman come up and give us a little announcement about the current program. So habitat is one of the things we talked about with that. That's one of the criteria, probably the biggest criteria. If you got a bunch of little kids in your yard and you want to introduce them to the birds, you can plant in a bunch of native bushes and things. So you're thinking in terms of, how can I improve my yard, mow less? What can I do to kind of surround the house with all this habitat? It's good for the insects as well, but for the Bird City program, conservationists, we think in terms of all these birds coming through. So I often think too, like you're visited by these things. It's really an awesome story, the different ones coming through. I remember we had one of those black-polled warblers one afternoon. It was singing in the woods right by our house here in town. And where's Lena? I know that Merlin stops at your place every spring. I don't know why. The habitat's good, but it might be the chickens in your backyard too. But I like that. The education and engagement, this is the part where we're playing tonight. Any conservationists, if you can work with the school districts, any youth groups around here, anybody you can find and get them interested in this. This particular city does a fairly decent job with that. Let's see, we have to address threats to birds. Well, there's your two right there. There's your cats. A few people probably know that free roaming cats just devour birds in your neighborhood. So we know about this in the countryside. They are a problem for the ground nesters, but in urban areas, they can really take a toll on stuff. So apparently, if you can keep them in your house, if you're supposed to, that would really be helpful. We had cats. We kept them in the house as much as we could, and I can tell you they will take a bird or two. The other thing is you can see the graphic of the apartments. That's about putting dots or anything on your windows to keep birds from striking the windows, because that is really disheartening to plant all that habitat and then have them glance off these windows and often kill themselves. So good thing to know. Then the last one is about sustainability. This is what Powered Up Baraboo is. It's about renewable energy. It's about doing things in your community and in your own residential areas to stop climate change, because in the end, that really makes those migrations much more difficult. Migrating back down south into stronger hurricanes or any hurricanes, not particularly pleasant. Nesting when it's really hot outside all the time is not particularly useful. So I won't say much more about that. Here is a Bird City yard tour. Is anybody in this room, were they on this tour? This might be 7 or 8 years ago. So this is a house I'm familiar with. Some of the landscape in there, we're familiar with that. But if you can believe it, we used to refer to it as a sod farm when we got it many years ago. So I think what was fun about this night is we passed around pictures of what the yard used to look like, what it looked like there. And it's just fun to walk your neighbors around and show them what you can do. And a lot of people do that in their houses. They start out maybe a little bit here, a little bit there. And the next thing you know, Lena, you don't have any grass to mow, do you? I think, is this my last slide? I have one more, okay. Excellent. Oh, of course. So this is what BRPA actually did at the woods up well, I still call it Boo-U, but there's these great white oak trees in there, and that was all where these students are standing. That was all floor to ceiling buckthorn that they helped us cut out over the years. So what was going on with that is we were having students come out, high school, middle school, from the university, service groups, and they would help us cut the invasives out. And then we would do that year after year, and eventually those things would disappear, and you would restore it back to this habitat that was full of some really great stuff. Birds you would never expect to be even landing in your city, some unusual things. The mourning warblers would land in there. And about this time of year, this may be a little later in May, judging by the flowers on the ground, but the kids could see grosbeaks, tanagers, they saw all the woodpeckers, and I mean, they were like right above you. You could watch all that. And to see them watch their work in the woods pay off was really cool. It was a full circle thing. So the more that they learned about the birds, they get interested in this topic. Our Migratory Bird Day, the first one is the photo on the right. I went out with a couple of the high school teachers that I was working with, and behind them, if you've never been into the high school, is a wall of taxidermy birds. I don't remember the story of why they're there, but it's a great sort of sciencey thing. In the past, here's what used to be here, and you can go out and see the actual live birds. So that was pretty cool too. Some of the stuff for habitat. We know this group, Powered Up Baraboo, is got their plant sale coming up. Shameless plug, you should all purchase their plants. But the cool thing about these, they are native plants. We have them in our yard. Great insects, great butterflies, and moths get on them. And they do actually, if you do it right, plant them in right, they will spread for you. So even a few flats of plants can become really nice habitat. Here's the sustainability part. You might recognize this building. That rooftop, I believe, is up over there. Powered Up Baraboo. Beth, I think you guys had a lot of stuff going on, getting the city involved and getting this particular project. It's a great idea of green building. It's a great idea of how to make things that actually generate their own electricity. I don't know, maybe there's an energy crisis in the future and you're happier you've got out in front of this sort of a thing. I think that's one of the tenets that a lot of the bird cities in Baraboo, they really spend time with this just as much as with the bird habitats. That's it? I'm good? All right, at this time, I'd like to have Dr. Hartman come up for the announcement.
Good evening, everybody. Just very quickly, yesterday we received some excellent news from Kelsey Bell, the state's Bird City Program Director. She's out of the Lake Michigan Bird Observatory. We got an upgrade to our status as a bird city. We have been at the sort of the basic level since the initiation or since our successful application back in 2016. We are now a high flyer community as of this year. That recognition is for those communities that truly go above and beyond in their conservation and education programs. And to become a high flyer, a community must meet additional and more involved criteria, which I guess I took the time to actually punch into the computer. So we were pretty much there. It's just you had to look, do we meet, can we push on some of these issues and maybe give ourselves a little bit more credit. And plus sometimes the criteria are altered a little bit. And so a couple of the areas that we were able to highlight this year that were fairly new, one was the solar panel project that had very much come online in the last couple of years. And so we were able to highlight that. The continuing education work that PUB does with on climate really scores points for our sustainability score. The fact that I happen to also chair the Bike and Pedestrian Commission with the City of Baraboo, and we published a master plan for bike and pedestrian networks here in town. That really counted a lot towards the sustainability goal in the Bird City program. And then last, going back to Todd's comment about cats and birds, I can tell you from firsthand experience as a veterinarian in my career as a wildlife rehabilitation veterinarian, and West suburban Chicago a long time ago. I can tell you what the devastation is that our native songbirds experience from cats that are allowed to roam free. The Bird City program has put a criteria on the establishment encouraging cities to promote resolutions or ordinances against trap, neuter, and release programs for feral or free-roaming cats. Actually, our current Baraboo City ordinances would make it virtually impossible to successfully establish a trap, neuter, release program in our community. And so it's kind of a vigilance. My appeal tonight is to stay vigilant about folks, neighbors, and associates who actually support or may actually be doing this kind of thing sort of on the side and creating what they think is a positive outcome for these animals, when actually that creates so many other problems, both for people and risk to people from bites and scratches and things like that, to problems with increased densities of the cats, and then obviously the birds that they prey upon. And so as a veterinarian, again, the ethical thing for me to do is to work to educate people to own pets responsibly, and to work with practices around town, for example, that might want to put out that messaging also, because it really is a preventive health issue for cats. Anyway, so those are some of the things that we've highlighted this year that have made our application a little more successful. So thank you.
Thanks. That's great to hear about our high flyer status. We'll take a little break from bird conservation now to think more about research and some local research efforts around the Baraboo Hills that are happening now and have happened in the past. And then we'll leave you with some good conservation messages tonight. So Lisa and I are both part of this Baraboo Hills Ecology Research Collective, and we're working across the hills to collect a lot of different types of data. But tonight I'll talk just about demography, or population dynamics, of some forest bird species, which pretty much are all neotropical migrants, so long-distance migratory birds that come here to nest in the summer. And so I think it's nice that we have such a big forest area here that we can think about as kind of our conservation responsibility. Like, when species arrive here, are they able to nest successfully? Yeah, we are thinking about birds kind of nested in this whole group of other species, especially arthropods, but I'll just talk about birds tonight. So we use bird banding techniques, so we can mark individual birds and then recapture them later throughout their lives. And how many people have seen bird banding happen before? Great. Okay, so most of you have seen this at some point. If you're curious if this is really new to you, on this table over here in the corner, we have some examples of like bird bands, the banding pliers. I can show you. There's one if you want to practice like opening and closing it, getting a feel for that. But banding just helps us understand more detailed things about birds than we might be able to learn just by listening to them and kind of taking a more non-invasive approach. So in particular, it helps us think about population growth rates, the health of individual birds, like in different habitat situations or going through time, and then especially migration ecology. But for us, we're working majorly with the first two right now. So we use a mist net to capture birds. It sounds like most people have seen this before. These nets work so that usually they're not in a situation like this where it's really visible, but it would be set up like in a forest early in the morning so the birds can't see them and try to fly through and get caught in one of the pockets. And then we spend a lot of years getting trained to like carefully untangle the birds so they aren't injured in any way. And then we attach leg bands to them. They each have a unique number that's linked to a database that all banders can access. And so we're able to have one bird with this unique number, so if it's seen anywhere else throughout its life, that data is all put in one place. While we have the bird in hand, we like to try to collect as much useful information as we can quickly, because it is stressful for an individual bird, so we want to make sure that we get like the best data we can out of the whole experience. And so here's some pictures of us measuring like the structural size of this woodpecker, looking at the flight feather characteristics of 2 different species, which helps us learn how old the bird is. And so we can start to construct like a population age structure, which is very helpful. Here we have 5 different banding stations where we collect these data long-term that are all in different forest and woodland situations around the Baraboo Hills. And we're collecting data in a standardized way, so kind of thinking back to hawk counts, all of our data feeds into this big like continent-wide effort. And so you can learn more detailed things about populations when you have more years of data collected by more people, more banding stations in different situations. And in particular, this effort, this Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship, or MAPS for short, this is really aimed at looking at how long adult birds are surviving and where are places where birds are able to produce more young. And so, for example, if we look into some of the data from these MAP stations, that I think these are collected over the last 2 decades, for a pretty common forest species, the ovenbird, that's found throughout a lot of eastern North America, we can start to see some interesting patterns emerge that are really helpful from a conservation perspective. So first, if we look at this figure on the left, ovenbird adults are not surviving for the same length of time on average across the US. So places where the map color is lighter, like where we are in Wisconsin, adult ovenbird have a lower survival probability. And then up in the Northeast, that's a place where they have much higher survival probability. In general, the times of an adult bird's life where they're more likely to die is during migration and maybe on the wintering grounds. And so this kind of helps us pinpoint that maybe for a lot of ovenbird populations, that might be a problem. Like regardless of how good the summer habitat is for them, if there's low adult survival, maybe we need to be thinking a little bit more broadly about these species throughout their lives. On the other hand, productivity has a lot to do with habitat quality during the nesting season. And so the figure on the right shows that, again, this is really unequal across the ovenbird's range. So down in the southern US, productivity is much higher than it is in some of these places further north. By these standards, Wisconsin is not looking very good for either measure. I will say, though, these graphs were made, this data was all analyzed before we started our 5 banding stations in Wisconsin. So there is a little bit of a data gap, and I'm really curious to see in a few more years if there's any change going on here. But yeah, these are things that are nice to study over a longer time that help us try to understand a little more detailed look at bird conservation. We have a few situations too where our data, even though it is so focused on like summertime, these are migratory species, and so we're able to see a few instances where individual birds have moved between areas either during nesting season or during migration, which is really exciting. For a songbird bander, on average, for every, I think it's about 1% of the birds that we put a band on are likely to be caught by someone else at a different station. So it's a really low number. Like for us at our individual stations, where we're going back to the same place year after year, multiple times a year, there we'll catch the same birds over and over again. But the chance of a bird moving between banding locations is like really, really low. So we were excited to have a ruby-throated hummingbird that was banded as a hatch year over by Leland move over to Natural Bridge to, we think, probably have a nest up there. So that was an interesting moment we got to notice. Their bands are so tiny, it's like you almost need a magnifying glass to see the little number on their legs. That was very exciting. We had a veery that moved between 2 different forest patches in the Baraboo Hills one summer. So interesting to think about, birds are not really stationary wherever they go to nest during the summer. There's a lot more going on, I think, than we always happen to be able to see. And then finally, we had a hatch year indigo bunting that we banded with a metal band with its number, but also with a pink color band on its right leg. And we were doing this so we could see the bird from a distance and without having to read the number, still know which individual it was. So this is part of a study we were doing at Hemlock Draw, and we just kind of thought at the end of the study, probably that will be the last we hear of the birds until they come back the next summer. But in between, this one hatch year was actually re-sighted in the Cayman Islands. So a photographer took a picture of this bird, didn't really notice the band, and then later was looking through her pictures and saw that it was there. And she contacted the bird banding lab, which is run by the USGS, and they keep track of all of these data. And so we were kind of able to look through and see that in the Baraboo Hills, that's one of the few sites where you have a permit to put pink color bands on indigo bunting. So we were able to trace this whole story together. It's very exciting. And really nice, it was a hatchier bird that they tend to just not survive their first migration very well. So it was nice to see that it was still alive and doing well all the way the next April. So that's a little bit about our songbird research. And now Lisa will talk more about specifically doing research to learn about bird migration. So it's this button to go forward.
Okay, when we were putting this together, I was just thinking about other ways that birds can be marked. And we've been talking a lot about bird banding. And with turkey vultures, they have this wonderful phenomenon where they defecate on their legs to cool themselves off. And it's like evaporative cooling, their form of sweat, I guess. And so like many turkey vultures had been banded up until about the mid-1970s, and they had leg bands put on them. But with this urohydrosis phenomenon that they do, the feces was caking up around the band and causing leg damage and injury to the bird. So it was deemed illegal to put leg bands on him anymore. So Mike Mossman started this project with tagging turkey vultures. And so instead of putting a leg band on, we would punch a hole through the skin in the patagium, which is this part of the wing right up here, like your patagium is about right here. And so that's a kind of, there's not many blood vessels in that part of the wing, and so you can punch a hole in the wing with a leather punch and then apply this tag. It's a vinyl tag that goes above and below the wing with a cattle ear button holding it on. And so when we were doing this, we were visiting turkey vulture nests in the Baraboo Hills and throughout Wisconsin and catching adults on the nest and then coming back later in the summer to catch the fledglings and mark them. And so the tag is visible both above and below the wing, and we were able to get much, when you put a leg band on a bird, you can't really see the number no matter what size the bird is, but we were able to follow individual birds. And pretty soon they get used to having that tag on and they start preening it along with the rest of their feathers. So we, and then out of that came, so this was done in the 1980s and then early 1990s. And so this was before internet. And we would send postcards to all the banding or bird population, what do you call them? Audubon societies and those kind of bird watching clubs around the country would send postcards out asking people to look for these tagged turkey vultures. And if they did see one, they would let the Madison Audubon Society know. And then Madison Audubon would let us know. And so, so we were able to get some lots of information about the nesting fidelity of the birds in the Baraboo Hills and how long they would live for. But we were also able to get some migration information. And in this map here, the yellow dots are the ones where turkey vultures were coming back up from the wintering grounds. And there's a migration of turkey vultures in the eastern United States that they go down to Florida and the southeastern states for the winter. But our turkey vultures in the fall, they were seen, those red dots were seen just on the Mississippi Flyway down into the southern states, and then no reports of them in the winter. And then in the spring, they would start returning from South and Central America and Mexico and coming up back into the United States. So we knew that our turkey vultures were part of this Mississippi Flyway, and one bird was found dead in Honduras. So we knew that our birds were not part of that eastern migration. And then in the last several decades, people are using transmitters on turkey vultures, and look at all the data they get from individual birds as they're traveling either in the eastern states down into Florida, and then in the like from Saskatchewan, the central United States, and then in the west coast, how they go all the way down into Mexico, Central America, and northern South America. So it's been pretty fascinating to learn all that. And we do have, Maia said she had the banding stuff on the back table there, so I did bring an example of a turkey vulture wing tag. And we also worked on the trumpeter swan restoration program, and in addition to putting the aluminum leg bands on them, which unfortunately I couldn't find one to bring tonight. They're a lot bigger than the ones Maia uses. But we put neck collars on them also, so I bought a neck collar. Unfortunately, this bird died from shotgun. There's a shotgun pellet right through the neck collar. So just other ways that birds are marked.
And I think one good takeaway from all of this too is that if you're out birding and you happen to see a bird that has some kind of tag or mark or something on it, try to get a picture and also report it to the bird banding lab, because it might be a really interesting piece of data for someone doing bird research somewhere. All right, so thinking a little bit just about the ways that we can contribute to bird conservation as individuals within a bird city or just in general. Bird cities do have a pretty big impact. These are just some stats from the last year. But throughout North and South America, there was a 33% increase in bird cities across 4 different countries. And the different conservation actions that we were talking about earlier, like things like leading a bird walk or doing some kind of sustainability decision in a city, there were 3,500 of those across the network last year alone. So very cool to think about kind of like the collective action of all of us thinking about birds in our own places. And 6 new state programs are underway already just this year. So we mentioned this a little bit, but some of the threats to birds during migration are window collisions, either during the daytime, just running into glass because they don't see that it's glass. It looks like a reflection, so just like a continuation of habitat to them. Or running into a building because it's really brightly lit at night. And this is a huge number, 1 billion birds a year, so it's a really big opportunity to think about how we can change some of these long-term population declines with small changes to our daily lives. So things like covering your windows with these dots. This is an example of a company called Feather Friendly that makes these like rows of dots. And they sent us some examples. There's on the back table there too, you can see how they look on a window, how they feel. I think they're really amazing. This company is also big into like research, and so they've found that there's a 95% reduction in bird strikes on windows that are covered in this product. So you can feel really good about it. Or you can also put anything on the outer surface of a window, and that will prevent quite a few bird collisions. The images I showed at the beginning tonight about birdcast, looking at where birds are during migration, that also does predictions. And so this is really helpful. I mean, the best practices would be to turn off your lights at night throughout the year and just limit light pollution as much as you can. Next best is like during migration season, at least try to do that. But if you need to have like a little bit more of a reminder, you can sign up for email alerts when there's a really big bird migration in your area on a specific night. So you'll get a reminder to just turn off as many outdoor lights as possible, make sure lights aren't coming out of your windows. So yeah, look at birdcast.org to sign up for that one. Feather Friendly is collaborating with the Bird City Network right now to help cities work on some of these like larger municipal buildings to cover their windows and make them more bird safe. So just throwing that out there. We talked a lot about cats and trying to limit the amount of times your cats are outdoors, maybe talking to your neighbors a little bit if you can, thinking about ordinances. There's also a lot we can do just in terms of trying to consume more responsibly, especially limiting products that we know have a lot of like pesticide baggage with them, trying to avoid single-use plastics, and supporting bird-friendly coffee as much as we can. And I believe there's, free samples of bird-friendly, sustainable coffee on the table. We're unfortunately, we're in part of the world where there's a lot of really big agriculture, and in the US, apparently 1 billion pounds of pesticides are used every single day. So if you're able to try to live in a way that doesn't use quite so much, Roundup or maybe conventionally grown food, that could make a really big difference. Same thing with plastics. They take 400 years to degrade, and our oceans already have a lot of them. Trying to support shade-grown coffee as much as you can. So much of our coffee supply in the Midwest comes from Central and South America, and those are places where it's easier to grow coffee in sun-grown conditions, but that definitely means a rainforest was cleared at some point to have those coffee farms. So trying to support shade-grown as much as you can. And then trying to have bird-friendly habitat in your own yard is really helpful. We already have enough lawns in this country. So especially during the nesting season, caterpillars are a really important food source for birds. And if you just think about, one single clutch of, this was actually Carolina chickadees, so I know they have a lot of nestlings, but 9,000 caterpillars for one nest is a really amazing number. So thinking about how many caterpillars do you potentially have in your yard, and how many nests full of super hungry nestlings could you support? Some studies have been done in suburbs where people either use native plantings or just kind of ornamental shrubs. And birds were actually starving in the nest in the places without native plants. So it's important. It's also, I think, nice to think about trying to garden for birds throughout the entire year. So not only having caterpillars during the summer, but maybe tree cavities where species could nest, or then use those cavities to survive really cold winter nights. Trees like oaks and hickories that provide mast for some species. Native shrubs that might have a flowering time where there's native pollinators that could be coming to those places, and then maybe berries during fall migration and shelter during the winter. These are all really nice things. And it's fun to think about these connections. So hummingbirds migrate north through eastern North America, and that's timed to when the columbine flower is blooming, and so that's an important food source. And then on its southward migration, the cardinal flower is blooming. And so planting both of those flowers in your yard is a much more ecological way to think about sustaining these species than just putting up a hummingbird feeder. And all of this you can learn more about at the native plant sale coming up. Finally, just thinking a little bit about the conservation theme for this year's World Migratory Bird Day, and thinking back to community science and some opportunities where maybe you could try to collect some data that feeds into these bigger networks to make a little bit more of an impact. So Cornell Lab of Ornithology, probably many of you are familiar with some of their programs, from eBird to Nest Watch. Maybe if you have a bird that's nesting in your backyard and you want to think a little bit more about its nesting ecology and submit some data. Or you're interested in this caterpillar situation and how many food resources you have in your yard. That's a great community science program. And then Journey North is really focused on hummingbird and monarch butterfly migrations. We also are looking for bird banding volunteers, or people who might want to learn a little bit more about collecting long-term data in the Baraboo Hills. And so if you look at that QR code, if you want to try to scan that, you can follow along on our website. We'll have some events coming up this summer as well if you want to see bird banding in action. Same thing here, the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology has a birdathon and bandathon coming up on May 30th. This is a fundraiser for their property in the Baraboo Hills, and you can also see a bird banding demonstration there. And the Great Wisconsin Birdathon is kind of happening right now. Different groups are going out and trying to find as many bird species as they can, and this is all kind of part of a conservation fundraiser. So these three things are great to keep in mind this migration season. And I think with that, we should have a little bit of time for questions.
So I was going to give a talk one night and about birds, and I'm looking at this library going up, and what it is full of glass. And of course, yeah, when I was in college, to get birds to do study skins, we just go right along the library windows during migration, and that's where we get most of our.
Yeah.
So when these architects, they seem to love glass, do they have like anybody saying, hey you, if you're gonna put all this glass, you gotta put this other stuff up to prevent bird collision?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if there's any effort to get like modern architects to try to make the glass a little bit more bird friendly from the beginning. And yeah, some architecture firms are really conscious of this, most are not. And in Madison, actually, there was a big community science effort to go around and see which buildings are contributing the most to bird collisions. And there were some horrible ones, and some of them were like the modern science buildings were just like notorious for birds colliding with these buildings. And so the city of Madison actually ended up passing an ordinance that said that all new commercial buildings above a certain size have to use bird-friendly glass. And that's a really amazing example of just kind of like predicting like this town is about to grow a lot. It's right on a lake. It's a really important migration corridor, and trying to like get out ahead of that. But yeah, I think that's a really good point.
I just want to mention that if you have been in Madison lately and have ridden the bus, the entire new bus system that they have, all of the shelters have bird-friendly glass in them.
Yeah. Yeah, which is really amazing. Just like the timing of that ordinance, and then like so much infrastructure was getting built right after that that all like had to have this bird-friendly glass. Yeah, anything else?
You talked about some of the technology that's being used for monitoring birds and bird migration. I keep hearing little snippets here and there about MODIS towers, and interest in getting more of those across the landscape. Can you talk a little bit about that technology and how it works and what we would learn?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is about MODIS towers, which were started by a biologist up in Ontario, and it's really nice. So a lot of the technology we were talking about with like tracking an individual bird was really kind of limited to like one scientist would have to either get the bird back to get its geolocator off to get those data, or just track one individual bird. But MODIS is really collaborative, and so they have towers that different people can set up on private land, anywhere really, and like within this network, a lot of people are then getting certain tags and using those to track birds through this network, and the data is all publicly available. You don't have to have a really big device on some smaller birds, and like even insects can be wearing a little MODIS tag, and then every time they go near a MODIS tower, that data will be stored. So it's a really cool effort. There's a high density of towers like up in Canada and then along the East Coast, but we don't really have very many here. There's a couple at Goose Pond, I believe, and it's kind of a challenging situation because the first few people who like put up these towers or start tagging birds won't get a lot of data, but once there's more momentum, then it starts to really pay off. So I think there's some talk of getting more of this infrastructure built in the Midwest. But at the same time, the technology is getting better and better, and so maybe sometime you won't even need all of these towers. Like even the small birds will be able to carry a device that uses like just satellite technology. So it's, yeah, interesting to see. Like I think a lot of the technology is developing really quickly right now. So yeah.
Is there a conversation at all of bird collisions with vehicles?
And sorry, where?
Bird collisions with vehicles?
Yeah, there is. So the question is about bird collisions with vehicles. I think it's a little bit harder to study maybe than bird collisions with buildings, because a lot of the people that keep track of buildings, can just walk right up and count how many birds. And with vehicles, it's a little bit harder. So I'm not sure of if vehicles are like a bigger threat than buildings or not. But Yeah, definitely it happens in the spring a lot of times. Like right now, it's a season where especially American robins are flying like really low over the road. Yeah, everyone's nodding, like it's very hectic if you're driving. And yeah, I think that one's a little bit trickier to solve, and maybe the thought is it doesn't affect quite as many birds, so the focus is more on buildings right now than vehicles, but not to say it's not a problem.
I have a question. Is there much conversation in your circles about either the myths or the realities of how wind turbines affect birds?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an important question. So thinking about how wind turbines affect birds, I think when wind turbines first started to become pretty common, the goal was always to put them in like the windiest places, which also happened to be really good migration flyways. And so there was a lot of problems with birds, especially like diurnal, like raptors migrating during the day. And yeah, either colliding with the wind turbines, or I guess just like the pressure, if they get close enough to the wind turbines, can like really negatively affect them too, even if they don't collide. But I think now there's starting to be a little bit more planning where people aren't putting turbines just like the absolute windiest place they can find. But I'm not, I guess, as sure about in the US, but I know like in Europe, there's a really big process before you can put any kind of energy infrastructure in like that to make sure it's not like a critical area for other wildlife. Yeah, anyone know more about that here? No. It's an important question. It's, yeah, hard trade-off, because like we want the sustainable energy, but also if it's really affecting wildlife, it's difficult.
Well, I know that we've got solar panels and they make really great perches for birds looking for insects. We got a lot of great pictures of bluebirds and babies on the solar panels with caterpillars and remote.
Oh, nice. Like adds to the habitat.